Thank you, Grady. It's so great to be here. I have to say that it's incredibly energizing to be in a room full of people that care about this issue, especially they're willing to come out on a Saturday morning with us and talk at length about it. It's such a privilege to be here and to be in this room with you all. Welcome to this next portion of the summit. As Grady mentioned, my name is Emma Sutton and I serve as the city's Housing and Neighborhoods Director. Our department improves the quality of life for Raleigh's residents by creating and preserving affordable housing, supporting neighborhoods, and funding local community organizations. The department also helps improve and maintain the quality of life for Raleigh citizens by enforcing city housing codes. I'm just going to take a moment and kind of ground the room a little bit and talk about a personal experience and why this work is so important to me and why housing is so important in all of our lives. Both of my parents experienced a great deal of housing instability growing up. My father in particular, he was raised in foster care, so he really never had that kind of housing stability that I was able to have because of his work and because of what he was able to do. So as soon as he was of age, he was working in a construction unit and he was in DC, and he was going to join the military because he knew that's where stability was going to come from for him. And there was a rumor in the construction site where he was working where the Air Force had the best housing out of all the military branches. Excuse me. And so he said, that's what I'm going to do. And it was right before the Vietnam War, and he knew he was going to serve over there. And he said, I'm going into the Air Force. And to this day, he's one of the biggest recruiters for the Air Force. Just based on their housing alone, he will tell you quality of Air Force housing is the best. So he went into the Air Force, he served in Vietnam, and because of that, he was able to purchase his first home for our family and go to college and get his degree in special education, both on the GI Bill. And I think it's important to note here, too, that one of the reasons why he was able to take advantage of the GI Bill is because he was white. Right? Not everyone was able to take advantage of the GI Bill in the way that he was. He often told us that too. He often said, people that I fought alongside are not able to live in the neighborhood we live in, are not able to go to the college that I went to. So because of that, he was able to be a lifelong educator in public school system. We lived in that house my entire life. That small 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom brick home with no central AC is in fact still used by my sister to raise her family to this day. That house was the reason why I had the stability and security that I needed to be able to develop and progress as a human and as a child, as an adult. So it really is the platform that undergirds all of us, right? Housing is so critically important to all of us. So with that, I'm going to start to talk about a little bit about the state of housing. And Pat Young and I, the Director of Planning Development, are going to go back and forth and ping pong a little bit to talk about state of housing and affordability in the city of Raleigh. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about the difference between affordability and affordable housing, as well as the state of housing, as I mentioned. And we're going to start off by watching this short video here on Affordable Housing 101.
Affordable housing is a key priority for the city of Raleigh. But what does it mean? Housing is affordable when a household spends no more than 30% of their income for housing costs, like rent, mortgage, and utilities. If you lined up every household in the Raleigh area in order from least to most income, the area median income, or AMI, is the amount in the middle. Area median income is used to determine eligibility for affordable housing programs. Affordable housing programs are targeted to households earning below 80% of the area median income, with some programs intended for lower area median income levels. We can think of the affordable housing landscape as a continuum that shows the range of affordable housing options available to residents. Affordable housing can be unsubsidized, meaning that it is naturally occurring in the market. This is often referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAH. Or affordable housing can be subsidized, meaning that it is funded in part by public or private nonprofit dollars. Community organizations, state and federal agencies, and local city and county governments all have a piece of the puzzle for creating enough housing options for the community. The City of Raleigh's piece of the puzzle includes supporting the development of affordable rental units, helping households with low incomes purchase their first homes, funding home repairs for long-term homeowners, and assisting persons experiencing or at risk of homelessness. We fund affordable housing programs through the $80 million Affordable Housing Bond passed in 2020, the city's general fund, by leveraging federal dollars, and more. Programs like the Housing Choice Voucher and Low-Income Housing Tax Credit are widely used to create affordable rental units. Subsidizing affordable units is no easy task. As of 2023, the average total subsidy amount needed to create one affordable rental unit in Raleigh is $159,000. The city contributes millions of dollars per year to support the creation of these affordable units. To learn more about what affordable housing looks like in our community and programs available to Raleigh residents, visit raleighnc.gov/housing.
Okay, so we're going to expound a little bit on some of the themes that were introduced in that short video. So as we all know, we have a housing affordability and homelessness crisis, both nationally and in Raleigh. And a city's affordability is influenced by 4 factors, and they are: 1, housing demand, which is the level of interest and need for housing within the city that influences its affordability. As demand increases, pressure on the housing market intensifies, which often leads to higher prices. The second is housing supply. The availability of housing units is critical in shaping affordability. Limited supply can exacerbate the cost of living, while an increase in housing stock can help alleviate some of that pressure. The third is development costs. The expenses associated with constructing and maintaining housing, such as materials, labor, and other overheads, impacts the final cost of residential properties. Higher development costs can lead to elevated housing prices. And the fourth is household income. The income levels of residents play a crucial role in determining affordability. Variations in household income affect the capacity of individuals to purchase or rent housing, thus influencing overall market affordability. And these factors interrelate to influence the economic landscape of housing within the city and collectively shape its affordability. Raleigh has seen significant shifts in these factors that have reduced our city's affordability and contributed to a growing homelessness crisis. And there's no single solution to this complex issue. Rather, a multitude of actions and participants will be required. So to repeat Greg Colburn's points, which again, just can't thank Greg enough for being here. At its root, homelessness is a housing problem. And this may sound obvious in a way, but in practice, many of the strategies to address homelessness are in fact not evidence-based and overly focused on social services, rather than the thing that actually ends homelessness, which is housing. As Greg Colbert noted, also Seattle and Portland do not have higher rates of homelessness because they have higher rates of substance use or mental illness than the rest of the country, but because in those cities, housing supply is lower and housing costs are higher. So where housing markets are more elastic, meaning they have fewer regulatory barriers and are able to respond more quickly to the growing need, homelessness rates are lower. And because homelessness is about affordability, the solution to ending homelessness is to increase incomes and or lower their housing costs. And I truly think we're at an inflection point with this issue in Raleigh. What we do now can really send us on one path or another. Either the path to ending homelessness with evidence-based and data-driven practice, or just simply managing homelessness with expensive management infrastructure. Large cities with rapid growth in incomes and high-income jobs, as noted, and equally rapid growth in homelessness, such as cities we discussed like Seattle, LA, Portland, they're a sign of what's to come if we don't invest in additional resources and establish a highly coordinated system to respond and truly end homelessness. And while homelessness impacts people of all ages, races, ethnicities, gender identities, and sexual orientation, it disproportionately impacts some groups and populations. And compared to the portion of U.S. population they make up, people of color, for instance, are overrepresented in the population experiencing homelessness. And ultimately, addressing homelessness requires tackling the systemic racial and economic inequalities that underlie housing instability. So there's a need for coordinated action, as I said, and fully integrated model that involves everyone affected by the issue. So we really think that both private and public involvement and resources are needed here. Doing nothing actually costs more and the community, costs people more and the community more than doing something and addressing this issue. And it's not a mystery how we end homelessness. We know exactly what works. We know how to do it. We even know how much it costs. The annual cost to taxpayers for one person experiencing chronic homelessness is far greater than the cost of ending someone's homelessness. National research from 2017 shows that on average, chronic homelessness costs the public sector around $36,000 per person per year, and that's from 2017, so imagine how much higher that figure is today. More recent examples from Houston show the cost to be as high as $96,000 per year per person experiencing homelessness. And this takes into consideration the high cost of emergency room visits, public safety costs, EMS, jail stays, and other public costs. Providing financial assistance to end someone's homelessness is cheaper than allowing them to remain homeless. Approximately $24,000 per household per year is all it takes to subsidize one family's housing and end their homelessness. Again, the most effective way to reduce public costs associated with homelessness is by moving people into housing and providing follow-along supports and services. One last note, too, is that clearing camps is not a viable solution. It merely displaces individuals, erodes trust in local government, and wastes resources without addressing the root problem. The city's Parks Department estimated they spent around $200,000 last year on clearing parks. The North Carolina Department of Transportation estimated about that same amount, paying for clearing camps in the city of Raleigh. None of that money going towards actual solutions to homelessness. So addressing housing and homelessness requires action on three fronts. Housing affordability means measuring housing costs relative to household incomes across a city's entire housing supply. Affordable housing refers to specific housing whose rents are legally restricted to be affordable to lower income households. And in the last 10 years, incomes and housing costs have grown unevenly, as we know. Some households are able to keep up, while others are not. In cities where incomes are rapidly increasing, again, homelessness is also increasing. And it is the gap between income growth and the lower end compared to housing cost inflation that spurs this rise in homelessness. So a little more on affordable as a definition. So the generally accepted benchmark for housing affordability is when a household spends no more than 30% of their income on housing costs like rent and utilities. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, growth in household incomes and cost of living are not in sync. So inflation in housing, food, and other expenditures is outpacing wage growth, leaving an increasing number of households with a housing cost burden. And due to centuries of systemic racism, housing cost burden is disproportionately shouldered by people of color. Approximately 38% of Black households and 32% of Hispanic households are cost burdened compared to just 21% of white households. I'll also note that transportation typically takes up about 20% of household expenditures. So communities with more density and greater transit connectivity create lower transportation costs for families, which frees up more income to put towards other living expenses like rent. So to talk a little bit about affordable housing, it is subsidized. So the definition of affordable housing is subsidized housing that serves specific income levels. This is where rents are capped and relative to the area median income, which was referred to in the video and on this slide. Overall, 48% of renters in Raleigh are housing cost burden, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And eligibility for most affordable housing programs is determined by this area median income, or AMI. And like as was stated in the video and shown there, if you lined up every household in the Raleigh area in order from least to most income, AMI is just in the middle. Affordable housing programs are targeted to households earning about 80% of AMI, with some programs intended for lower AMI levels. Income limits for these programs are updated each year. And Pat will talk more in depth about AMI later in his presentation, but you can see here just how high area median income has risen. 80% of AMI for a 4-person household is almost at $98,000. And for a 2-person household, 80% of AMI is just over $78,000. So the majority of people earning 80% of the area median income and below are not living in affordable housing units. For every 3 families that would qualify for income-restricted affordable housing, there's only 1 unit available on the market. So to talk a little bit about fair market rent is a HUD term that describes rents in the 40th percentile in a given market. So in other words, if the average rent in a city is in the 50th percentile, fair market rent is just below that. And in the Raleigh metro area, fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is currently about $1,650 per month. And this is incredibly high compared to the national average. It's more expensive than fair market rent in 96% of other markets. It has also grown rapidly in recent years. The 2024 fair market rent is about 17% higher year over year from 2023. I'm now going to turn it over to Pat Young to talk about the state of affordability and homelessness in the city of Raleigh. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, Emila, and good morning. Pat Young, Director of Planning and Development. Like Emila, this issue is very personal to me. Imagine a young Pat Young in my late 20s living in Boston, Massachusetts, and realizing I would never be able to own anything. It's one of the most expensive cities in the country. So I moved to Raleigh for a job. I found an incredible community. I met a girl. We have 2 kids. And right after this presentation, I'm taking my daughter to college. So it's personal, right? Housing is personal. Without the opportunity, thank you. So without the opportunity to find affordable housing, it's impossible to make a community a home. Our department, Planning and Development, works with the council and with the community to develop long-range vision plans. One of those long-range goals that we have and have had for a long time is that Raleigh is accessible and affordable to all. And that's something that our manager's office and our council talks about a lot, and we support Emila's team in doing that. So I'm going to provide a little bit of Raleigh-specific context and kind of do a deeper dive on a lot of the structural foundations of our affordability crisis and our homelessness crisis that Greg talked about and that Emila talked about. Oops. There we go. Sorry about that. Operator error. As you heard from Emila, the relative affordability of any city or region is based on 4 factors. They're shown on the top of this slide: demand, supply, development costs, and household income. And since 2017 to 2022, the most recent year for which data is available, the median gross rent in Raleigh has gone up approximately 37% due to all 4 of these factors, and we'll discuss each of those in turn. You heard a little bit from Greg and Emila, but we're going to go into some of the Raleigh specifics here. The acceleration in rental costs and housing prices that I'll talk more about here is primarily due to increased demand to live in Raleigh. It's the biggest factor in our housing crisis and our homelessness challenge. Raleigh's rising demand for housing is driven by 2 closely related factors. The first is population growth. Raleigh is the 2nd fastest growing metro region in the country for the past 10 years, second only to Austin, Texas. Since just 2010, we've grown by over 70,000 people here in Raleigh. And our metro region, which includes Wake, Johnston, and Franklin County, has grown by over 350,000 people. So this growth, as you heard from Greg, means that more people are competing for what has been an inadequately growing housing supply, and that alone drives prices up. A second key factor is that much of our population growth is residents from outside of our region, and they are often from more expensive parts of the country. They're relocating for higher paying jobs and a lower cost of living. As high as the cost of living here is in Raleigh, it's much higher in many of the jurisdictions you heard Greg talk about in his presentation. Raleigh has almost twice the national average of jobs over $100,000 per year, and many new residents bring both more income and more wealth than existing Raleigheites, which means that they can outcompete existing residents for housing opportunities. That gets back to Greg's analogy of Usain Bolt. There's plenty of opportunities for folks who bring a lot of income, but for existing Raleigheites, there can be struggles. The graphic that you see here reflects changes in land valuation since 2014. Land valuation is almost a direct surrogate for demand to live in an area. And the oranges and reds reflect areas of higher land value increases, and the blues and purples are lesser. You'll note that housing demand is particularly strong in our in-town, inside the Beltline neighborhoods and in other neighborhoods that feature more walkable, transit-oriented housing options. And with this new preference for in-town urban living has meant that many historically affordable neighborhoods, like where I live in East Raleigh and places like South Park, Hungry Neck, Battery Heights, and Roberts Park, have, just as to name a few examples, are neighborhoods that are less affordable to long-term residents because of demand being driven by a lot of new residents. Meanwhile, existing homeowners are moving less often due to interest rates that are much higher than they were 4 or 5 years ago, and that limits the availability of older homes, which are often more affordable homes. A second key factor is insufficient housing supply for folks at all income ranges and all household types. Prior to 2021, 55% of our city and over 70% of our residentially zoned land was limited to single-family housing only. Single-family housing is an excellent and important housing type and option, but it is not affordable and not desirable to many residents, particularly younger folks that are retired, and single-person households. This lack of housing choice increased competition for the limited supply of housing and drove up prices and continues to do so. Additionally, there was a big lull in home building nationally, but also in our region after the 2008-2010 Great Recession. In 2021 and 22, Raleigh City Council passed a series of zoning reforms that allowed more housing types and more places in the city. And I'm really proud and happy to report that it's been one of the most successful and productive zoning reform efforts in the country. The missing middle refers to types of housing larger than a single-family house, but smaller than a 4- or 5-story apartment. So that includes things like duplexes, triplexes, quads, and small garden apartments. Since the adoption of these provisions in 2021, the market has responded strongly. There's been over 2,000 units approved. That's almost 1/3 of all units being in a missing middle enabled housing type. These are units that would not have existed or could not exist prior to 2021. Coupled with the strong multifamily deliveries that you heard Greg mention, these policies have helped stabilize prices in Raleigh over the last 2 years. We've seen large increases over the last 5 years, but in the last 18, 24 months, there's been less so. And we think that at least partially, there's many factors at play due to this new supply that has been enabled by these zoning reform efforts. But due to the existing deficit in units, the city has lost over 30,000 units since 2017 that were previously naturally occurring affordable housing, meaning affordable to folks at 30% of their income, to low moderate income folks without subsidy. So we're still playing catch up and we still have more to do. A third component of our affordability challenge is rising development costs. Land development includes land costs, construction costs, and financing costs. All three have risen significantly over the past 5 years, and that contributes to rising rent and housing prices. The biggest increase proportionally is land costs. And again, that tracks back to that demand to live in our region. In many parts of the community, in our highest demand parts of the community, we've seen building lots go up over 400% in the past 10 years. And additionally, construction costs have outpaced inflation and increased by nearly 20% since 2020, although they have moderated recently. And of course, finance costs for both homeowners and builders are at a 20-year high. So all of these factors push prices upward. And finally, and very importantly, as you heard from Greg and Emila, is income. Higher incomes lead directly to higher housing prices and more homelessness. and Raleigh has had an over 50% increase in average household income since just 2017. Let me repeat that again. For a family of four, the average income in 2017 was right around $80,000. Now it's $122,000 plus. This reflects those higher paying jobs I mentioned earlier, and many of which are taken by new arrivals to Raleigh who bid up the cost of housing. All of this is reflected in the amount of income required to afford the average mortgage in Raleigh, which has risen, unsurprisingly, by about 50% since 2017, with a similar effect for renters. So the average, the income needed to afford a house that's at about 30% of the total cost of available houses is about $85,000, and that was just near $40,000 as late as 2017. The median income data obscures an important point, which is that inflation-adjusted incomes are falling for low-income households. This has improved slightly in the last year or two, but it still appears to be the case. They're stagnant for middle-income households who have seen almost no real income growth over the past 10 years, and then incomes have risen significantly faster than the national average here in Raleigh because of all the high-paying jobs we have at the top 10% of the income spectrum. And as you heard from Emila, 400 years of racist policies in this country, the average black family has about 10% of the wealth of the average white family. So these conditions create and reinforce each other, the racial wealth gap and the home ownership gap we see in Raleigh and across the country. So, yeah, and that's the, excuse me. As you heard from Greg Colburn, homelessness is a housing problem. It's closely linked to the phenomenon I've discussed and that you heard Greg and Emila discuss. Stagnant incomes for low and middle class, rising incomes for newcomers, higher development costs, and inadequate housing supply. These factors have led to unsheltered homelessness increasing significantly in the past couple years. Since 2020, nearly doubled. And this slide shows the location of encampments. The orange dots are places where people were found sleeping unsheltered in city parks between 2022 and 2023, and the blue dots are folks that were identified at the January point in time count that you heard my colleagues mention, where folks were recorded living outside in January of this year. Combined, again, these represent a significant increase in both the number and the diversity of locations that folks are living unsheltered. So in conclusion, again, reinforcing some of the points my colleagues have made, affordability is driven by those four factors of demand, supply, development costs, and household income. Rising demands and construction costs have inflated rent, inflated home values. Supply has not kept up, but zoning reform and a surge of new units has helped significantly. And incomes have not kept up with the greatest need for housing in Raleigh at the lowest income levels. And of course, homelessness, as you heard from Greg and Emma, is directly tied to affordability of housing. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Emila to talk about the state of affordable housing, some of the things we're doing to address these phenomenon that we framed out. Thank you.
And Pat's going to be back too, so I should have said hold your applause because we're going to ping pong. Thanks, Pat. So as Pat mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the city is addressing these issues. So the city has multiple housing policy goals as shown on this slide and working to achieve all of these goals. They are all important and must be done together to create a healthy housing market with consistent and sufficient housing supply at all price points. However, with limited funding and resources, and we'll look a little bit about there's a slide on resources, and you can see what Greg Colburn referred to as the federal government not doing us any favors with the amounts. We'll talk a little bit about that, but the limited funding sources, they really require these trade-offs, and they're necessary also in order to balance these priorities. So in 2016, the city set an aspirational goal to create 5,700 units, affordable units, by 2026. And while there are several models to deliver affordable housing units, the most of the units in Raleigh leverage what is called the low-income housing tax credit program. And Mark Shelburne is going to be up to talk more in depth about LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit. But that is the largest financing tool for affordable housing in this country. And most all LIHTC projects within the city are ones that the city has provided gap financing for. And it's also important to note that we partner with the county to provide these gap funds to make projects viable together with our gap funds that otherwise would not be. And again, later in the day, Mark is going to come up and talk a little bit more in depth about low-income housing tax credit program and the creative financing that it takes to make affordable housing projects happen. And the city efforts to invest in affordable housing development are recent. Before about 2015, the city's annual investment in affordable rental production was less than a quarter of what it is today. And now the city is focusing on production through gap financing and leveraging tax credits. We're also expanding our portfolio programs to reach residents at different incomes. That is providing deeper affordability and in different situations, including people experiencing homelessness. But we cannot produce fast enough, and the homelessness crisis is at our doorstep today. We need to access market rate units and mechanisms to create affordability in existing housing. We are losing more naturally affordable units than we're able to create. So let me actually go to this one. As we talked about, the city has limited funds and resources, and here is how we're allocating them. You can see in the upper portion of this graph are the local funds going towards affordable housing and homelessness, and the bottom portion are federal funds. So most of the city's direct funding supports new rental development, and most federal support comes in the form of tax credits, as I discussed, rather than direct subsidy, and those funds go directly to the developers. Again, talk more a little bit about that after lunch. Other federal funds include annual allocations from the federal government in the form of emergency solution grant funds, community development block grant funds, and home program funds. And these are incredibly important federal funds. They're allocated to support things like home buyer assistance, home repair, emergency drop-in, shelter, and public services, and also just general support to the homelessness response system. So while it is this portion, it is an incredibly vital part of our system. The annual bond amounts for fiscal years 2024 and 25-26 is $11.8 million, and to date, we are 80% committed or spent bond funds from the affordable housing bond passed in 2020. It's also important to note that federal funds can be less flexible than local funds, so there is some creativity that can go into local funds that there is some flexibility and creativity, and we are definitely exploring that every day, how best to use those federal funds. But there is some more flexibility with local as well as any private funds that we can have access to. So we talked previously about how housing development costs have led to rising rents in Raleigh, and since rents for affordable housing are restricted to lower income levels, rents cannot be raised to cover these higher costs, and instead these projects are requiring more subsidy from the city and other public sources to be financially feasible to construct. So we need to actually dedicate more resources now to create the same number of units as before. And again, a theme today is really about ending homelessness and how we know how to do this. We have a clear understanding of how to achieve it. Currently, also, the city's vacancy rate is higher than it has been in recent years, which presents a valuable opportunity to collaborate with private landlords to access those units that are currently on the market. I'll say, too, that private investment can also play a crucial role. We have a speaker later today that's going to talk a little bit about the importance of private investment in addressing homelessness. But it provides really flexible funds to be able to address whatever needs are specifically happening in a household in order to get them quickly housed. So, and all of these things together can really turn our knowledge into action and make a significant impact on ending homelessness. So the city is working towards several housing policy goals, as we discussed. and achieving them often involves making these tough choices. We've invested more money than ever before into developing affordable housing, but there are still gaps to fill, particularly in those more urban areas. And despite increased funding efforts, finding affordable housing in these bustling city locations remains a challenge. Further takeaways include that the number of subsidy requests to the city is increasing, which means we need to allocate more resources just to maintain our current level of affordable housing production. Additionally, the city has set aside funds for initiatives like the Unsheltered Pilot Program and homelessness prevention and diversion efforts. Later, I'm going to talk more about this pilot and about the unsheltered strategy planning work. However, to address the public health emergency and meet rising housing demand, we need even more resources. I'm going to ping pong it back over here to Pat to finish us out. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks, Imola. So my last section was pretty gloom and doom, right? But we are doing a lot of great things. Raleigh is really a regional and national leader on trying to address the challenges that you've heard Greg and Imola characterize. You recall there are the 4 factors that drive housing or housing affordability and homelessness crisis that have led to significant housing price and rent increases here in Raleigh over the past several years. Again, those are listed on top of the slide. The 2 biggest factors are housing demand and household income, and they are really outside of our control. I think that's an important point. These are things that local government, really nobody can influence, since we are such an attractive area to live, and we are having a lot of investment that is driving high-paying jobs. So these are the biggest factors accelerating the cost of housing, and our ability to influence them is limited. But there are 2 really important pieces: housing supply and development costs, that can be influenced significantly by the city and by our partners. And I'll talk a little bit about Raleigh, what Raleigh is doing in each of those areas. So, of course, the aim here is to reduce the affordability gap. It is impossible with today's land prices and construction prices to build housing that's brand new and affordable without subsidy from local government or from a mission-based nonprofit. So the whole goal here is to make the gap less so that we can house more people affordably. So a foundational strategy for affordability is to allow and encourage the supply of housing to more closely meet demand. To be clear, and you heard Greg say this, policies that encourage housing supply will not make housing affordable by themselves, but it is impossible to have housing affordability in your city or your region without an ample supply of homes. So it's a foundational and necessary step, and Raleigh has done a lot in that area. As mentioned earlier, North Carolina, we are prohibited from tools such as mandatory rent control or mandatory inclusionary zoning, but that doesn't mean we don't have tools. This is a map of the city, and I know it's probably hard to see from where you are, but all the areas that are in color there are areas where more housing types were allowed in 2021 and 2022 by a council action. The effort was what's called broad but shallow, and what I mean by that is it affected a lot of the city, but it only incrementally or modestly changed what could be built. So where you could only have a single-family house, you can have a single-family house or a duplex and a townhouse. There's a lot of emerging research that shows that that's the right way to do zoning reform. If you do it in a limited small area, it drives up the cost of land in that area and doesn't have the impacts you want. So we're really proud of this work, and we owe a lot to council for the leadership to get this done. It allowed builders to build with a staff level approval pursuant to council adopted rules. And this reduces the uncertainty and cost of development, which is very high, and encourages more housing. And this is how we've seen those 2,000 units permitted since 2021 that I mentioned earlier. Council has also authorized an incentive program. We cannot require affordable units, but we can provide incentives through the zoning ordinance that allows for more units to be built near planned high-frequency transit, and that near those areas, affordable housing is required if over 12 units of housing is built. So there's a lot of advantages to building housing near transit. It makes the transit system more productive. It makes the per unit cost of those high costs we talked about less. But This program incentivizes units that are legally binding to folks at 60% of the area median income or lower for 30 years, and we produced over 200 units in that program just in the last 2 years. Finally, City Council has eliminated parking minimums. Most developments still provide parking, almost every development does, but they provide less than they did previously. This translates directly into more affordable housing since each surface parking lot costs approximately $20,000 to provide on site, and at least twice that if it's provided in a parking deck or other structure. As I noted earlier, a timely and predictable development review process is a crucial component of maintaining a steady supply of much-needed housing. You heard Greg talk about San Francisco. We have Chapel Hill in our own region, which is a beautiful place like San Francisco is. The process of building and developing is extremely costly, it's extremely lengthy, and it's extremely uncertain. And that really makes getting the supply we need at the prices we need difficult. Most developers are borrowing money to develop. And that uncertainty brings more risk, higher costs, and just less housing. The development review process is one of the few areas the city has a high level of control, so we've worked really hard across the board to make sure development applicants understand the rules and ensure a smooth process. We've provided additional support for an expedited development review for our affordable housing projects and for accessory dwelling units, which are backyard cottages or granny flats. We worked with community members to identify over a dozen designs that have been pre-reviewed, pre-approved by our building and safety team, and that makes the development review process less costly and more timely, and therefore cheaper, and we see more accessory dwelling units. We've had about 250 of those approved just in the last 3 years. And we are continuing to explore the possibility of fee waivers and deferrals. There are some legal challenges with that we're still working through. I mentioned the fact that, and it's been mentioned several times, that we don't have some of the tools that some of our peers have: rent control, impact fees for housing, inclusionary zoning. But I mentioned those incentives that we provided, and I won't reiterate those, but for development near our planned transit lines, we do have an incentive that requires affordability over 12 units, and we feel like we've hit the sweet spot where it's practical for those developments to be built, but still some modest number of affordable units are provided directly. And again, all of this new development helps contribute to the improvement of the game of musical chairs, as you heard from Greg. And finally, the city is a regional leader in ensuring the federal, state, nonprofit, and local dollars are used to support affordable housing. I won't repeat what Emila shared. I just want to emphasize that we've spent over $116 million, or will spend by the end of this year. Most, 3/4 of that is local money. And preserved or produced over 6,000 units, close to about 6,600 units. Again, Emila did a deeper dive on some of those programs, but that really makes us a real regional leader. And as Greg said and Emila said, there are always going to be folks that, because their income is so low, the market will not be able to house them affordably. We need to have that subsidy available, and we need to expand our programs here to be effective. We're also trying some innovative approaches, and you're going to hear a lot more about those later from my colleagues to talk about some of the exciting and innovative approaches we're looking at to ensure affordability and accessibility. A great example of this is using one of our most valuable assets, which is city-owned land that's surplus. We have a site east of Moore Square, immediately east of Moore Square, which is in our downtown, which is one of our highest demand areas. We have a public-private partnership that will include affordable and market rate housing, retail, a hotel space, and a new Raleigh Rescue Mission building. A combination of ground lease and funds from sale of city parcels to our private partner will subsidize the market rate units and create affordability in this area where it's so greatly needed. And we are in community engagement efforts now on a similar redevelopment site at the former state DMV site on New Bern Avenue, and there's a number of other sites throughout the city that we are doing a similar process. So in terms of key takeaways, Raleigh is really committed to tackling this puzzle. There is no silver bullet solution. There's only kind of this patchwork quilt of solutions that we need to weave together and work continuously to implement. Our zoning reform efforts to increase supply are an important and foundational piece of this. They are the most ambitious in the state and one of the most successful and productive. in the country. And we've committed more resources than ever before to building new affordable housing, as you heard from Emila, resulting in over 6,000 units that are legally binding affordable. And we continue to, as you're going to hear a lot more about later after lunch, we continue to explore innovative tools to improve affordability and build more affordable units, and ultimately to end homelessness. In the interest of allowing you to get to lunch, we are not going to take questions, but we want to answer your questions. Please use the QR code, or you can use the notebooks that were included in your tote bag. If you don't want to use a QR code to leave a question, we will answer every question we get and publish those responses when we publish this material in the coming days or week. But we really appreciate your time. I'm going to turn it over to Grady to take us into lunch. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share this information.